this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on necessary assumption questions in the logical reasoning section. Necessary assumption questions fit within the assumption family in the logical reasoning section, and 57% of all logical reasoning questions belong to the assumption family. 11% of all logical reasoning questions are necessary assumption questions. So it's a common question type, an important one, and a challenging one for a lot of folks. You can identify a necessary assumption question by the language within the question stem. So you're looking for language that suggests that you're dealing with a needed or necessary assumption of the argument. You could also be looking for a question stem that suggests that you're on an assumption question, but doesn't give you any indication of necessity or sufficiency. And so by default, they become necessary assumption questions. In this case, we're looking for an assumption on which the argument depends. It depends on is necessary. Or in this case, the argument relies on a particular assumption. So relies on tells you that it's a necessary assumption question. In this case, the argument presumes which one of the following? Presumes tells you that you're dealing with an assumption question, but there's no other language that suggests sufficiency or necessity, so by default it becomes automatically a necessary assumption question. In this case, you're looking for a required assumption, again, necessary. Or the conclusion above follows logically only if which one of the following is assumed. So the word assume tells you that you're on an assumption question, and the words only if tell you that it's a necessary assumption question. Or the argument above is most vulnerable to the criticism that it takes for granted. So this argument takes something for granted. That's like assumes it to be true. And there's no other language that suggests sufficiency or necessity. So this automatically becomes a necessary assumption question. The process for necessary assumption questions is the same as it is for the remainder of the assumption family. You always first find the conclusion, then identify the evidence that supports that conclusion, and then evaluate the reasoning, meaning you have to judge the argument. And in every single question within the assumption family, the conclusion does not follow from the evidence. There's a gap in that reasoning, and it's your job to find that gap. Then you use that gap to anticipate what an answer might sound like, and then you look at the answer choices. Now, there are two common forms when you're looking at necessary assumption questions. There's the linking form, where you're trying to build a bridge in a gap in a chain of conditional reasoning. And then there's the defending form, where you're trying to protect the argument from something potentially devastating to it. So let's take a look at each of these. We'll start out with the linking form. In a linking form, you're trying to provide the missing link in the argument. And remember, the premises are the segments of a journey that have already been established. If you're trying to get from point A to point D, and they've given you that A implies B and that C implies D, you're trying to find, the conclusion is the completed journey, and the assumption is the missing link in that journey. So you're trying to find if B then C in the answer choices to build a bridge to get to fill the gap in the journey. If we put this into a real example, maybe we're trying to get from trimming rhino horns to the rhinos surviving. So maybe their conclusion looks something like, if we trim off all the rhino horns, we will ensure that rhinos survive. And then they give you a premise that says, if we trim off all the rhino horns, we will eliminate the threat of poaching, and ask you to find the missing piece in that argument. So since the missing piece is the part that will get you across the gap, we'd be looking for something like, if we eliminate the threat of poaching, we will ensure that rhinos survive. If we take the premise plus the assumption, put them together, then we would get to that conclusion. And so that's like a linking assumption. So let's see this in a real LSAT example. Go ahead and pause the recording, try this question on your own, see if you can find that missing gap in your own, and then look for it in the answer choices. When you think you've got the answer, go ahead and hit play and come back, and we'll work through it together. Great, welcome back. So first things first, find the conclusion. We see the word thus sitting there within the argument. That tells us that we're looking at the conclusion. So the conclusion is that shifts of narrative point of view within a novel, either between first and third person or of some other sort, detract from the merit of the work. And the evidence that they tell us for why that's true is that such shifts of narrative tend to make most readers focus on the author. Right? So we've got a premise that says that shifts of narrative make you focus on the author, and a conclusion that says that shifts of narrative detract from the merit of the work. And you're going to see why I call that not high quality in just a second here, because I'm trying to connect it back to the first premise, which is that a novel cannot be of the highest quality unless most readers become emotionally engaged with the imaginary world it describes. So if something is going to be of high quality, then you have to have most of the readers engaged in the imaginary world that it describes. And that link between high quality and detracting from the merit, we needed to interpret the conclusion in a way that allowed us to see that those terms were essentially the same, so we could go hunting for the gap in the reasoning. Whenever you have a term on the right side of the conclusion, you'd like to have it on the right side of the evidence. And we could do this little magic trick with that first premise, and we can take the contrapositive, and we can now reinterpret it as saying, if most of the readers aren't engaged with the imaginary world it describes, then the work is not going to be of high quality. And so now we have the right side of the conclusion on the right side of the evidence, and then we have the left side of the conclusion already on the left side of the evidence. And then to see the gap a little bit more clearly, let's go ahead and rearrange the premises such that we can recognize that there's a gap missing in the middle, which is that if you focus on the author, then you're not going to have most of your readers as engaged readers they're not going to be engaged with the imaginary world it describes. So we're looking for that in the answer choices to build the bridge. If we look at answer choice A, most readers become emotionally engaged with the imaginary world described by a novel if the novel is of the highest quality. So this is essentially restating that first premise. And as such, it's not going to make the argument any better. A necessary assumption needs to build a bridge that makes the argument better. This is actually simply restating a premise. We're going to call it a premise support. If we look at answer choice B, a novel is generally not considered to be of high quality unless it successfully engages the imagination of most readers. Engaging the imagination is not exactly the same thing as being emotionally engaged, but let's call it close enough. Even then, it's simply restating that first premise. Even if we give it a little bit of extra leeway in terms of the terms that are being used there, it's simply restating the premise as did answer choice A, and it's a premise support, so we can get rid of it. We're looking to add something to the argument that makes it better, not simply restate the premises. Answer choice C says, most readers cannot become emotionally involved with a novel's imaginary world if they focus on the author. So if they focus on the author, then they're not going to be emotionally engaged. This looks very close to what we were looking for. Let's hold on to it. Answer choice D, most readers regard a novel's narrative point of view as representing the perspective of the novel's author. What these readers regard as a novel's narrative point isn't really relevant. This is out of scope. Answer choice E, shifts in narrative point of view serve no literary purpose. Well, the argument, it does seem to be suggesting that shifts of narrative point of view aren't going to lead to the highest quality work, but to say that they serve no literary purpose is a bit strong for this argument, so we can eliminate it on that ground. And now that we've gone through each of the choices, answer choice C was the only one that really matched what we were looking for. We can pick it and move on to the next question. So that's the process for linking. Let's look at the process for defending. In a defending argument, the right answer is going to protect the argument from something devastating. And so I like to think of the argument as like a glass cube in this case. This is a metaphor of a glass cube in order to visualize the argument and protecting it. So we can go back to that same example about trimming off the rhino horns and eliminating the threat of poaching. Even if we were to look at this argument from a defending perspective, right, there is this linking mechanism that's taking place within the argument that we could go and find that gap. But we could also try to defend the argument from a devastating consideration that we didn't think of initially. So, for example, what could be potentially devastating to this argument? What are some ideas that would destroy it? Well, they're concluding that if we trim off all the rhino horns, we will ensure that rhinos survive. Why? Well, if we trim off all the rhino horns, we will eliminate the threat of poaching. But eliminating the threat of poaching doesn't necessarily guarantee that the rhinos are going to survive. They may face existential threats beyond poaching. Right? There could be other things to consider. Right? So rhinos may need their horns to defend themselves from predators. Right? If you trimmed off the rhino horn and they needed them to defend themselves from predators, well, then the rhinos may not survive. Right? So rhinos may face existential threats other than poachers. If that was the case, let's say it was either disease or loss of habitat, Any of those things could theoretically come out of the blue and destroy this argument. Or maybe rhinos may need their horns to find food. I'm not exactly sure what rhinos eat, but I think I heard that they might be vegetarians. Even if they're vegetarians, maybe they're using their horns to dig for roots or something. There's a whole host of reasons why rhinos may need their horns, or there could be other reasons why rhinos may face extinction other than poachers. Right? And we could probably sit here for a very long time and come up with ideas that may be potentially devastating to this argument. We don't necessarily need to come up with every single idea because it would take us forever, but we do want to come up with a couple of ideas to make sure we understand how this argument works. And that's why sometimes when you're working through a necessary assumption question, the right answer, it seems like it's coming out of left field, and sometimes it may even feel out of scope because it wasn't something that was directly addressed within the argument. But that's the problem with the argument, is that it was relevant and it was important, and yet it wasn't considered in the argument itself. And so we may need to protect the argument from dangerous ideas, and we won't necessarily be able to anticipate each of those dangerous ideas. So sometimes the right answer may feel like it's coming in out of the blue. Our job is to basically swat those bad ideas away, defend the argument from them from them being true. And while that won't guarantee that the conclusion follows, because even if we swipe away one rock or one bad idea, one dangerous idea, the other dangerous ideas could theoretically exist. And so, we want to keep in mind that this is a trick that will work for necessary assumption questions. It won't necessarily work for sufficient assumption questions because by ruling out one dangerous idea, others could still exist and it won't guarantee the conclusion. So if we can rule out one of those dangerous ideas and say something like rhinos do not need their horns to find food, well, that would protect the argument from something dangerous and be a necessary assumption of that argument. And this leads into one of the tactics that people use when they're working on necessary assumption questions, which is the negation test. Essentially, the way it works is after you've found the answer choices that you think are contenders for the right answer, you go on to negate them to see which of them would destroy the argument's reasoning. If you negate an answer choice and it doesn't destroy the argument, then it wasn't necessary to the argument. Whereas if you negate an answer choice and it does destroy the argument, then that idea was needed for the argument to be true. And sometimes it's easier to hear when an answer choice is devastating to the argument once you've negated it into the threat. So you may want to negate an answer choice and see if it destroys the argument. And that's particularly useful when you're dealing with answer choices that work through defending the argument. So here's an example. Go ahead and pause the recording, try this one on your own, and come back in a few minutes and we'll discuss it together. Great. All right, so let's take a look. Remember, the first step is to find the argument's conclusion. And in this case, in that last sentence, we see the word therefore. So we know that the last sentence is the conclusion, which is that it is less costly to tan leather if biological catalysts are used instead. Okay, so what's the evidence for that? Well, tanning leather using biological catalysts costs about the same as using these conventional chemicals if the cost of waste disposal is left out of the comparison. So we've got the total cost of tanning leather using conventional methods minus the disposal cost is equal to the total cost of tanning leather using biological methods minus the disposal cost. Okay? And they also tell us that nearly 20% less waste is produced with biological catalysts, and waste disposal is a substantial part of the overall cost. So we've got the disposal aspect down, but the problem with the disposal aspect is that they're talking about the amount of waste that needs to be disposed, and they don't really talk about the cost of that waste. So it's possible that the conventional method, the cost of disposing that larger amount, could still be less than the cost of disposing the smaller amount. For the biological, like you want to be thinking about things like hazmat and like getting rid of some materials may be more expensive than getting rid of other materials. Right? And so if we can make sure that the cost of disposing the biological catalysts is less than the cost of disposing the conventional catalysts, then we would ensure that the argument works. So let's look at the choices here. Answer choice A says that leather tanned using the conventional process is not lower in quality than is leather tanned using biological catalysts. Well, the quality of leather isn't really relevant to this argument. It's all about the cost of production, and what people think about it afterwards doesn't matter. So this one's out of scope. Answer choice B, the biological catalysts that can be used in the tanning process are less costly by weight than are calcium oxide and sodium sulfide, which are the catalysts in the conventional process. Right? So if the biological catalysts, this is talking about the cost of something within that big group, which they said the total minus disposal. Right? They told us that the total minus disposal for both conventional and biological were about the same. And if you were to go ahead and break down the costs within those groups, more specifically, it doesn't really help us because it's a cost within that total sum, and it's the total sum that we're using. Right? So this is simply being much more specific or stronger than what we need to be discussing. We don't need to know the individual breakdowns. We just need to know about the cost of the disposal. So this is simply too strong. Not our answer. Answer choice C says, new technological innovations have recently made the use of biological catalysts in the tanning process much more cost effective. Well, we don't care about what it was before or how that compares to today, right? We care about what it is today. And so C is kind of out of scope. Like that comparison between what the cost is today versus before doesn't really matter. So we can get rid of C as out of scope. Answer choice D, disposal of tanning waste produced with biological catalysts does not cost significantly more than disposal of the same amount of waste produced with the conventional process. Notice in there's that negative language, does not cost significantly more. What doesn't cost significantly more? Disposal of tanning waste produced with biological. So the biological stuff does not cost significantly more to get rid of than the conventional stuff, which, while this doesn't say that the biological stuff costs the same or less, it's needed to know that it does not cost significantly more in order for it to cost the same or less. Right? So actually D is protecting the argument from a dangerous idea, and if you did negate it, disposal of tanning waste produced with biological catalysts does cost significantly more than disposal of the same amount of waste produced with the conventional process. That would completely destroy the argument. So this looks like a good contender. Answer choice E says the labor costs associated with tanning leather using biological catalysts are not any. This feels very much like answer choice B, where it was getting into the specific costs. And we don't necessarily care about those specific costs other than the disposal costs because everything else was lumped together. So we can get rid of answer choice C as being too strong again. And that allows us to choose answer choice D as the right answer. So while we're thinking about necessary assumption questions, you want to be thinking about the trap answers that are likely to show up. Like, how could you describe the wrong answers in a way that's generic, that could be applied to many different answer choices? So about a third of all wrong answers on necessary assumption questions are simply wrong because they're out of scope, while 15% of wrong answers are wrong because they're actually working against the argument as opposed to in favor of the argument. They're weakening the argument. 31% of wrong answers on necessary assumption questions are simply stronger than what the argument needs to assume, right? If you're looking for a necessary assumption, anything that goes beyond what you need could be potentially problematic. So you want to be on the lookout for answer choices that look good but are stronger than what you needed to assume. Answer choices that simply support a premise, 6% of wrong answers are wrong for that reason. Negations and reversals both hover negations and reversals both hover around 4 or 5%. Answer choices that build like if-then relationships but use the wrong trigger are about 4%. Answer choices that contradict the information given are about 2%. And answer choices that are simply too weak would be 5%. So here are the trap answers that you really want to be paying attention to and their relative frequencies within this particular question type. In summary, you spot a necessary assumption question using language like requires, depends on, relies on, language that implies necessity, or assumption questions that simply don't give you any language cues telling you sufficiency or necessity, like the argument assumes something to be the case. That would be a necessary assumption question. The reasoning structures you want to be thinking about, remember linking, which is essentially conditional logic, about 41% of the time, defending, which is more of the causation and comparison realm, more like 51%, 59% of the time. So, be thinking about defending very frequently. A little bit more than half the time, the right answer will work by defending the argument from a dangerous idea. A little less than half the time, the argument will work by connecting unconnected ideas that need to be connected in order for the argument to work. And then the trap answers, the most important ones that you want to be paying attention to, are out of scope. Obviously, those are fairly easy to spot. Answer choices that are stronger than what you needed to assume. Answer choices that actually work against the argument. Ones that simply support some of the evidence or negate the relationship that was underlying or assumed to be the case within the argument. So that's it for today's lesson on necessary assumption questions. I invite you to watch some of these other lessons here at LSAT Lab, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.